Chapter 32 of the Hampstead Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Hampstead Mystery by John Watson and Arthur Rees. Chapter 32. The public interest in the Holymead trial on the second day was even greater than on the first. It was realized that Kemp's evidence had given an unexpected turn to the proceedings, and that if it could be substantiated, the jury's verdict would be not guilty. There were confident persons who insisted that Kemp's evidence was sufficient to acquit the prisoner, but everyone grasped the fact that the counsel for the prosecution, by his action in applying for an adjournment of the cross-examination of Kemp, clearly realized that his case was in danger if the evidence of the first witness for the defence could not be broken down. The public appetite for sensation having been whetted by sensational newspaper reports of the latest phase of the Riversbrook mystery, there was a great rush of people to the Old Bailey early on the morning of the second day to witness the final stages of the trial. The queue in Newgate Street commenced to assemble at daybreak, and grew longer and longer as the day wore on, but it was composed of persons who did not know that there was not the slightest possibility of their gaining admittance to No. 1 Court. The policeman who was invested with the duty of keeping the queue close to the wall of the building forbore to break this sad news to them. Being faithful to the limitations of the official mind, he believed that the right thing to do was to let the people in the queue receive this important information from the sergeant inside. How was he to know, without authority from his superior officer, that any of these people wanted to be admitted to No. 1 Court? So the policeman pared his nails, gallantly minding the places of pretty girls in the queue, who, worn out by hours of waiting in the cold, desired to slip away to a neighbouring tea shop to get a cup of tea before the court opened, and sternly rebuking enterprising youths who endeavoured to wedge themselves in ahead of their proper place. The body of the court was packed before the proceedings commenced. The number of ladies present was even greater than on the first day, and the resources of the ushers were severely taxed to find accommodation for them all. In the back row, Crewe noticed Mrs. Holymead, accompanied by Mademoiselle Chiron. They had not been in court on the previous day. Mrs. Holymead seemed anxious to escape notice, but Crewe could see that although she looked anxious and distressed, she was buoyed up by a new hope, which doubtless had come to her since Kemp had given his evidence. There was an expectant silence in the court when Mr. Justice Hodson took his seat and the names of the jurymen were called over. Kemp entered the witness box with a more confident air than he had worn the previous day. Mr. Walters rose to begin his cross-examination, and the witness faced the barrister with the air of an old hand who knew the game, and was not to be caught by any legal tricks or traps. "You said yesterday, witness," commenced Mr. Walters, adjusting his glasses and glancing from his brief to the witness, and from the witness back to the brief again, "that you saw the prisoner enter the gate at Riversbrook about 9:30 on the night of the 18th of August. "Yes." The monosyllable was flung out as insolently as possible. The speaker watched his interrogator with the lowering eyes of a man at war with society, and who realized that he was facing one of his natural enemies. "Did he see you?" "No." "You are quite sure of that?" "Haven't I just said so?" "Do not be insolent, witness." It was the judge's warning voice that broke into the cross-examination. "Answer the questions." "How long was it after the prisoner entered the carriage drive that you went to the edge of the plantation and heard voices upstairs?" continued Mr. Walters. "I went as soon as Mr. Holymead passed me." "How far were you from the house?" "About 60 yards." "And from that distance you could hear the voices?" "Yes." "Plainly?" "Not very. I could hear the voices, but I couldn't hear what they were saying." "Were they angry voices?" "They seemed to me to be talking loudly." Yet you couldn't hear what they were saying? No, I was 60 yards away. You said in your evidence in chief that the talking continued half an hour. Did you time it? No. Then what made you swear that? I said about half an hour. I smoked out a pipe full of tobacco while I was standing there, and that would be about half an hour. Kemp disclosed his broken teeth in a faint grin. What happened next? I heard the front door slam, and I saw somebody walking across the garden and go into the carriage drive towards the gate. Did you recognize who it was? Yes, Mr. Holymead. Kemp looked at the prisoner as he gave the answer. You swear it was the prisoner? I do. Let me recall your evidence in chief, witness. You swore that you identified Mr. Holymead as he went in, because he struck a match to look at the time as he passed you, and you saw his face. Did he strike matches as he went out? No. Then how are you able to swear so positively as to his identity in the dark? Kemp considered a moment before replying. Because I know him well, and I was close to him, he said at length. I was close enough to him almost to touch him. I knew him by his walk and by the look of him. It was him right enough, I'll swear to that. I put it to you, witness, persisted counsel, that you could not positively identify a man in a plantation at that time of night. Do you still swear it was Mr. Holymead? I do, replied Kemp doggedly. What did you do then? I stayed where I was. What for? I don't know. I didn't have any particular reason. I just stayed there watching. Did you think the prisoner might return? No, replied the witness quickly. Why should I think that? How long did you stay watching the house? It might be a matter of 10 minutes more. And the prisoner didn't return during that time? No, replied the witness emphatically. What did you do after that? I went to the tube station. The prisoner might have returned after you left. I suppose he might, replied the witness reluctantly. Well now, witness, you say you stayed 10 minutes after Holymead left, and during that time Sir Horace opened the window and leaned out of it. Yes. You saw him distinctly? Yes. You are sure it was Sir Horace Fewbanks? Yes. Now, witness, said Mr. Walters, suddenly changing his tone to one of more severity than he had previously used, you have told us that you heard Sir Horace Fewbanks and the prisoner in the library while you stood in the wood by the garage, and that subsequently you saw Sir Horace leaning out of the window after the prisoner had gone. You are quite sure you were able to see and hear all this from where you stood? Yes. Are you aware, witness, that there is a large chestnut tree at the side of the library, in front of the window? Kemp considered for a moment. Yes, he said. And did not that tree obstruct your view of the library window? No. Witness, said Mr. Walters solemnly, listen to me. This tree did not obstruct your view when you went to Riversbrook a week or so ago to decide on the nature of the evidence you would give in this court. It is bare of leaves now, and you could see the library window and even see into the library from where you stood. But I put it to you that on the 18th of August, when this tree was covered with its summer foliage, you could no more have seen the library window behind its branches than you could have seen the inhabitants of Marsh. What answer have you got to that, witness? There was a slight stir in court, an expression of the feeling of tension among the spectators. Kemp drew the back of his hand across his lips, then moistened his lips with his tongue. Come, witness, give me an answer, thundered prosecuting counsel. I tell you I saw him after Mr. Holymead had left, declared Kemp defiantly. His voice had suddenly become hoarse. To the surprise of the members of the legal profession who were in court, Mr. Walters, instead of pressing home his advantage, switched off to something else. I believe you have a feeling of gratitude towards the prisoner? He asked in a milder tone. I have, said Kemp. His defiant, insolent attitude had suddenly vanished, and he gave the impression of a man who feared that every question contained a trap. "He did something for a relative of yours, which at that time greatly relieved your mind." "He did, and I'll never forget it." "Well, we won't go further into that at present, but it is a fact that you would like to do him a good turn." "Yes." "You came here with the intention of doing him a good turn?" Kemp considered for a moment before answering. "Yes." "You came here with the intention of giving evidence that would get him off?" "Yes." "You came here with the intention of committing perjury in order to get him off?" Mr. Walters waited, but there was no reply to the question, and he added, "You see what your perjured evidence has done for him?" "What has it done?" asked Kemp sullenly. "It has established the prisoner's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt in the minds of men of common sense. You did not see Sir Horace Fewbanks that night after the prisoner left him. You could not have seen him even if he had leaned out of the window. But your whole story is a lie, because Sir Horace was dead when the prisoner left him." "He was not," shouted Kemp. "I saw him alive. I saw him as plain as I see you now." The man in court who was most fascinated by the witness was Crewe. He had watched every movement of Kemp's face, every change in the tone of his voice. "I wonder what the fool will say next," whispered Inspector Chippenfield to Crewe. "He will tell us how Sir Horace Fewbanks was shot," was Crewe's reply. Mr. Walters approached a step nearer to the witness box. "You saw him as plainly as you see me now?" he repeated. "Yes," declared Kemp, who it was evident was labouring under great excitement. "You say I came here to commit perjury if it would get him off." He pointed with a dramatic finger to the man in the dock. "I did, and I came here to get him off by telling the truth, if perjury didn't do it. You say I've helped to put the rope round his neck, but I'm man enough to tell the truth. I'll get him off, even if I have to swing for it myself." This outburst from the witness box created a sensation in court. Many of the spectators stood up in order to get a better view of the witness, and some of the ladies even jumped on their seats. Mr. Justice Hodson was momentarily taken aback. His first instinct was to check the witness and to ask him to be calm. But the witness took no notice of him. He displayed his judicial authority by an impressive descent of an uplifted hand, which compelled the unruly spectators to resume their seats. It was on Mr. Walters that Kemp concentrated his attention. It was Mr. Walters whom he set himself to convince, as if he were the man who could set the prisoner free. Of the rest of the people in court, Kemp in his excitement had become oblivious. "Listen to me," said Kemp, "and I'll tell you who shot this scoundrel. He was a scoundrel, I say, and he ought to have been in jail himself instead of sending other people there. I went up to the house that night to see if everything was clear, or whether that cur Hill had laid a trap. That part of my evidence is true. And from behind a tree in the plantation I saw Mr. Holymead pass me. He struck a match to look at the time, and I saw his face distinctly. A few minutes afterwards I heard loud angry voices coming from somewhere upstairs in the house. I thought the best thing I could do was to find out what it was about. I said to myself that Mr. Holymead might want help. I walked across the garden and found that the hall door was wide open. I went inside and crept upstairs to the library. The light in the hall was turned on, as well as a little lamp on the turn of the staircase behind a marble figure holding some curtains, which led the way to the library. The library door was open an inch or two, and I listened. I could hear them quite plainly. Mr. Holymead was telling him what he thought of him. And no wonder. It made my blood boil to think of such a scoundrel sitting on the bench and sentencing better men than himself. I thought of the way in which he had killed my girl by giving her 5 years. It was the shock that killed her. 5 years for stealing nothing, for she didn't handle the jewels. and here he had been stealing a man's wife and nothing said except what Mr. Holymead called him. I stood there listening in case they started to fight, and I might be wanted. But they didn't. I heard Mr. Holymead step towards the door, and I slipped away from where I had been standing. I saw the door of another room near me, and I opened it and went in quickly. I closed the door behind me, but I did not shut it. I looked through the crack and saw Mr. Holymead making his way downstairs. He walked as if he didn't see anything, and I watched him till he went through the curtains on the stairs at the bend of the staircase, and I could see him no more. Then I heard a step, and looking through the crack I saw the judge coming out of the library. He walked to the head of the stairs and began to walk slowly down them, but when he reached the bend where the curtains and the marble figure were, he turned round and walked up the stairs again. He walked along as though he was thinking, with his hands behind his back and nodding his head a little, and a little cruel, crafty smile on his face. He passed so close to me that I could have touched him by putting out my hand, and he went into the library again, leaving the door open behind him. Then suddenly, as I stood there, the thought came over me to go in to him and tell him what I thought about him. I opened the door softly so as not to frighten him, and walked out into the passage and into the library, and as I did so I took my revolver out of my pocket and carried it in my hand. I wasn't going to shoot him, but I meant to hold him up while I told him the truth. He was standing at the opposite side of the room with his back towards me and a book in his hand, but a board creaked as I stepped on it, and he swung round quickly. He was surprised to see me, and no mistake. "What do you want here?" he said in a sharp voice, and I could see by the way he eyed the revolver that he was frightened. Then I opened out on him and told him off for the damned scoundrel he was, and he didn't like that either. He edged away to a corner, but I kept following him round the room, telling him what I thought of him, and seeing him so frightened, I put the revolver back in my pocket and walked close to him while I told him all the things I could think of. As I thought of my poor girl that he'd killed, I grew savage, and I told him that I had a good mind to break every bone in his body. He threatened to have me arrested for breaking into the place, but I only laughed and hit him across the face. He backed away from me with a wicked look in his eyes, and I followed him. He backed quickly towards the door, and before I knew what game he was up to, made a dart out of the room. But I was too quick for him. I got him at the head of the stairs and dragged him back into the room and shut the door and stood with my back against it. I told him I hadn't finished with him. I had mastered him so quickly and was able to handle him so easily that I didn't watch him as closely as I ought to have done. He had backed away to his desk with his hand behind him, and suddenly he brought it up with the revolver in his hand. "Now it's my turn," he said to me with his cunning smile. "Throw up your hands." I saw then it was man for man. If I let him take me, I was in for a good 7 years. I'd sooner be dead than do 7 years for him. "Shoot and be damned," I said. I ducked as I spoke, and as I ducked I made a dive with my hand for my hip pocket, where I had put my revolver. He fired and missed. He fired again, but his toy revolver missed fire, for I heard the hammer click. But that was his last chance. I fired at his heart, and he dropped beside the desk. I didn't wait for anything more. I bolted. I got tangled in the staircase curtains and fell down the stairs. As I was falling, I thought what a nice trap I would be in if I broke my leg and had to lie there until the police came. But I wasn't much hurt, and I got up and dashed out of the house and over the fence into the wood, the way I came. He stopped, and his gaze wandered round the hushed court till it rested on the prisoner, who, with his hands grasping the rail of the dock, had leaned forward in order to catch every word. Kemp turned his gaze from the man in the dock to the man in the scarlet robe on the bench, and it was to the judge that he addressed his concluding words. You can call it murder. You can call it manslaughter. You can call it justifiable homicide. You can call it what you like. But what I say is that the man you have in the dock had nothing to do with it. It was me that killed him. Let him go and put me in his place." He held his hands outstretched, with the wrists together, as though waiting for the handcuffs to be placed on them. End of chapter 32 of the Hampstead Mystery by John Watson and Arthur Rees. Read by Lars Rolander.
Chapter 33 of the Hampstead Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mary Rhodey. The Hampstead Mystery by John R. Watson and Arthur J. Rees. Chapter 33. An hour after the trial, Crewe entered the chambers of Mr. Walters, K.C. "I congratulate you on the way you handled him in the witness box," said Crewe, who was warmly welcomed by the barrister. "You did splendidly to get it all out of him, and so dramatically too." "I think it is you who deserves all the congratulations," replied Walters. "If it had not been for you, there would not have been such a sensational development at the trial, and in all probability Kemp's evidence would have got Holymead off." "Yes, I'm glad to think that Holymead would have got off even if I hadn't seen through Kemp," replied Crewe thoughtfully. "I made a bad mistake in being so confident that he was the guilty man." "The completeness of the circumstantial evidence against him was extraordinary," said Walters, to whom the legal aspects of the case appealed. "Personally, I am inclined to blame Holymead himself for the predicament in which he was placed. If he had gone to the police after the murder was discovered, told them the story of his visit to Sir Horace that night, and invited investigation into the truth of it, all would have been well." "No," said Crewe in a voice which indicated a determination not to have himself absolved at the expense of another. "The fact that he did not do what he ought to have done does not mitigate my sin of having had the wrong man arrested. The mistake I made was in not going to see him before the warrant was taken out. If I had had a quiet talk with him, I think I would have been able to discover a flaw in my case against him. What made me confident it was flawless was the fact that both his wife and her French cousin believed him to be guilty. Mademoiselle Chiron followed Holymead from the country on the 18th of August with the intention of averting a tragedy. She arrived at Riversbrook too late for that, but in time to see Sir Horace expire, and naturally she thought that Holymead had shot him. When Mrs. Holymead realized that I also suspected her husband, and had accumulated some evidence against him, she sent Mademoiselle Chiron to me with a concocted story of how the murder had been committed by a more or less mythical husband belonging to Mademoiselle's past. Ostensibly the reason for the visit of this extremely clever French girl was to induce me to deal with Rolfe, who had begun to suspect Mrs. Holymead of some complicity in the crime. But the real reason was to convince me that I was on the wrong track in suspecting Holymead. Of course she said nothing to me on that point. She produced evidence which convinced me that she was in the room when Sir Horace died, and as I was quite sure that she believed Holymead to be guilty, I felt that there could be no doubt whatever of his guilt. "It is one of the most extraordinary cases on record, one of the most extraordinary trials," said Walters. "You blame yourself for having had Holymead arrested, but you have more than redeemed yourself by the final discovery when Kemp was in the witness box that he was the guilty man. That was an inspiration." "Hardly that," said Crewe with a smile. "I knew when he swore that he had seen Sir Horace leaning out of the library window that he was lying. After the murder was discovered, I inspected the house and grounds carefully, and one of the first things of which I took a mental note was the fact that the foliage of the chestnut tree completely hid the only window of the library. Ah, but there is a difference between knowing Kemp was committing perjury and knowing that he was the guilty man. There is at least a distinct connection between the two facts, said Crewe, who after his mistake in regard to Holymead was reluctant to accept any praise. Kemp's description of the way in which Sir Horace was dressed showed that he had seen him. The inference that Kemp had been inside the house was irresistible. Sir Horace had arrived home at 7 o'clock, and it was not likely that Kemp would hang about Riversbrook, the scene of a prospective burglary, until after dark, which at that time of the year would be about 8:30. He must have seen Sir Horace after dark, and in order to be able to say how the judge was dressed, he must have seen him at close quarters. The rest was a matter of simple deduction. Kemp inside the house, listening to the angry interview between Holymead and Fewbanks, Kemp with his hatred of the judge who had killed his daughter in the dock, and with his desire to do Holymead a good turn. I had previously had proof of that from my boy Joe, whom you have seen. Besides, Kemp fitted into my reconstruction of the tragedy on the vital question of time. How long did Sir Horace live after being shot? The medical opinions I was able to obtain on the point varied, but after sifting them I came to the conclusion that though he might have lived for half an hour, it was more probable that he had died within 10 minutes of being hit. "How is that vital?" asked Walters, who was keenly interested in understanding how Crewe had arrived at his conviction of Kemp's guilt. Holymead's appointment with Sir Horace at Riversbrook was for 9:30 p.m. The letter found in Sir Horace's pocket-book fixed that time. It was exactly 11 p.m. when he got into a taxi at Hyde Park Corner after his visit to Riversbrook. On that point the driver of the taxi was absolutely certain. I was so anxious for him to make it 11:30 that I went to see him twice about it. Assuming that Holymead arrived at Riversbrook at 9:30, I allowed half an hour for his angry interview with Sir Horace, half an hour for the walk from Riversbrook to Hampstead Tube Station, and half an hour for the journey from Hampstead to Hyde Park Corner, which would have involved a change at Leicester Square. As I could not induce the driver of the taxi to make Holymead's appearance at Hyde Park Corner 11:30 instead of 11, I had to admit that Holymead must have left Riversbrook at 10. But it was 10:30, according to Mademoiselle Chiron, when she found Sir Horace dying on the floor of the library. Therefore, if Holymead did the shooting, the victim's death agonies must have lasted half an hour or more. Medically, that was not impossible, but somewhat improbable. But a meeting between Kemp and Sir Horace after Holymead had gone filled in the blank in time. That came home to me yesterday when Kemp was in the witness box committing perjury in his determination to get Holymead off. I take it that the interview between Kemp and his victim lasted about 20 minutes. Therefore, Sir Horace was shot about 10:20, certainly before 10:30, for Mademoiselle heard no shots while nearing the house. "You have worked it out very ingeniously," said Walters. "You must find the work of crime detection very fascinating. I am afraid that if I had been in your place, that is, if I had known as much about the tragedy as you do when Kemp was in the witness box yesterday, I would not have seen anything more in his evidence than the fact that he was committing perjury in order to help Holymead." "I think you would," said Crewe. "These discoveries come to one naturally as the result of training one's mind in a particular direction." "They come to you, but they wouldn't come to me," said Walters with a smile. "But do you think Kemp's story of how Sir Horace was shot is literally true? Do you think Sir Horace got in the first shot and then tried to fire again?" If that is so, I don't see how they can hope to convict Kemp of murder. A jury would not go beyond a verdict of manslaughter in such a case. You handled Kemp so well that he was too excited to tell anything but the truth, said Crewe. Sir Horace fired first and missed. The bullet which Chippenfield removed from the wall of the library shows that. And he pulled the trigger again, but the cartridge, which had been in the revolver for a considerable time, probably for years, missed fire. Here is a silent witness to the truth of that part of Kemp's story. Crewe produced from a waistcoat pocket one of the 4 cartridges he had removed from the revolver Mademoiselle Chiron had handed to him, and he placed it on the table. On the cap of the cartridge was a mark where the hammer had struck without exploding the powder. End of chapter 33, and end of the Hampstead Mystery.